This session is called Inventing Our Future. I congratulate Elion Sal for a lecture which opened up many possibilities for us. At the same time, I remain convinced that the General Assembly should not have a theme. The General Assembly should reflect the diversity of research interests within the community, and out of that discussion should develop the agenda for the next 4 years. I am pleased to introduce this panel. I will not be giving very long and elaborate introductions. That I leave to you. Over the next 4 days, you can meet, you listen to the people, those who interest you, you can meet them and you can find out more. The speakers will go in the order in which they are introduced in the program. So the first speaker will be Adam Habib, seated on my right. Professor Adam Habib, who is also the Vice Chancellor and Principal of University of Witwatersrand in South Africa, Wits University. The second speaker will be Adebayo Olukoshi, seated immediately on my left, a former Executive Secretary of CODESRIA. IDEP, currently head of... Okay, between jobs. He was head of IDEP, and he won't tell us where he's going now. Yang Guang, Institute of West Asian and African Studies, Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, I assume Beijing. And Benjamin Soares, Afrika-Studiecentrum, the African Studies Center in the Netherlands. This is a fairly wide range in terms of scholarly interest. And together they should be able to map out for us a fairly broad field for discussion. So I propose to follow the following method. Each speaker will have 10 minutes to make an opening statement. We will then open up for comments from the floor, maximum 2 minutes. You can ask a question or make a comment, but maximum 2 minutes. And then we will return to the speakers for a response and a summation, 5 minutes each. Okay, we have an hour and a half. So if we say their opening and closing statements are 15 minutes each, that's an hour for them and half an hour for you. Okay? Thank you very much. Let's begin with Adam Habib.
Thank you, Mahmood. Thank you, colleagues. It's really a pleasure to be here, and it's really a pleasure to be to be invited to share my thoughts on inventing our future. What I thought I should kick off with is, this is an interesting follow-up to the earlier two keynote addresses we have from Carlos Lopez and Aloan Sal, and their contrasting visions, because they were really contrasting visions that they put forward. And I really want to start with Carlos Lopez's address yesterday, which central message was that Africa must take a lead in its own development. And if it is going to be taking charge of its own future, its ideas must emerge from within its own ranks, on the continent and within the African diaspora. And really what he asks for is his leaders is to actually enable that to happen. Aloan Sal said, for instance, that we must learn to imagine our future. Now, what I want to do is focus today on how do we create the incentives for leaders to do this? How do we give them the capacity to do this? And that's important. There was this wonderful imagery, analogy of the African lion gobbling globalization. I want to put an alternative imagery. I want the African gazelle. How do we charm, cajole, political elites, powerful stakeholders to act in ways that are beneficial to an inclusive future. Because I don't think we have the capacity at this moment to gobble globalization. I think we need a much more nuanced strategy, if you like, a strategy informed by the notion of Antonio Gramsci's war of position. How do we engage in structural reforms that have a transformative potential, and how do we facilitate that in this context? So what I want to look at is the strategy of getting to the future we want. We can imagine that future, but what we also need to think about is how do we create the conditions to get there from a very hostile environment that we currently exist. So there are two assumptions I'm making. The one is that we operate in a hostile world, and there's powerful stakeholders who are opposed to the vision that we have. They have alternative visions, and they are going to deploy their forces and their capacity to ensure those alternative visions. And what we need to think through is how do we enhance our power and undermine theirs to enable our vision to predominate. The second thing that I think is important is that our future is not going to be born in a single moment, in a single revolutionary moment. Rather, it is going to be a product of a continuous set of engagements and initiatives that slowly we need to think through about the kinds of reforms that have the kinds of transformative effect that we want. And so what I want to look at is at two levels, at the international level and at the national level. At the international level, I think it's worth bearing in mind that the world is fast moving to a multipolar world with the emergence of China on the global stage and the emergence of some of the other BRICS countries. I think that's a positive feature. And I think it's important to recognize that this is not important because China is going to enable our development. I don't think that's on the cards. But what it does do is it gives African countries and African political elites in particular the ability to play off global powers against each other to maximize space for the inclusive development agenda. This is what Southeast Asian states were particularly successful in from the 60s to the 90s. The ability to play off countries against each other to maximize opportunities for development on their own side. And if this opportunity is to be capitalized upon, we clearly need a much more coherent African agenda. We need a coherent African plan, because if you don't have that, then the multipolar world, the powers of the world can play you against each other rather than you having the capacity to play them against each other to maximize your own opportunities. And to do that, it seems to me, we need three things. We need an institutional architecture on the African continent. We need a security agenda on the African continent. And increasingly, what we're going to require is a common market, which Carlos spoke about yesterday. And the common market is particularly important because it enhances African political elites' leverage vis-a-vis external investors, vis-a-vis MNCs, vis-a-vis other countries. This is the singular lesson of China over the last 25, 30 years. How it used its market size as a leverage in engaging external players and in ensuring that MNCs and others invested in ways that enhanced their own agenda. We also need, it seems to me, 2 or 3 countries that underwrite these things. I mean, I know progressives don't like talking about this, but 2 or 3 countries, there's been no regional agenda, no continental-wide agenda, no global alliance without 1 or 2 countries taking the lead in underwriting the collective goals to enable that to happen. They have to underwrite the security agenda. They have to underwrite the costs of the institutional architecture. They have to underwrite the costs of the collective goods that enable a common market. And that's something that we need to think through about. Now, we had some of this on the African continent between about 1998 and 2008, but clearly that's been eroded in recent years, particularly as a result of developments in Nigeria, as a result of developments and the recent political regimes in South Africa. And I think we need to re-establish that if we're going to be serious we need to reestablish that alliance that can underwrite a collective security and economic agenda on the African continent. But even if you succeed in doing that, what you'll give political elites is leverage. The question is, how do you create an incentive for the political elites to act in a developmental and inclusive way? And too often, we think getting the right person in the right job will make this happen. What we should be thinking about is the checks and balances, what in Marxist lingo we call the balance of power. How do you create the balance of power to act and force political elites to act in particular directions and not others, whatever their own personal preconceptions? And that's where I think the second part of the conversation emerges. What you need is two sets of initiatives at the national level. The first is you need a democracy. But more important than a formal democracy, you need a viable opposition. Because it is precisely that viable opposition that creates the threat of losing office. And it is precisely that threat of losing office that establishes the accountability dynamic and prompts political elites to act in a responsive way towards development. The second is you clearly need the mobilization of poor people and citizens within this thing. You need them organized. You need them organized in trade unions, in civic bodies, and what that does is create the incentive structure for political elites. As they look right over their right shoulder towards what investors want, they must be forced to look over their left shoulder to what effectively citizens want. And that's what you want to really do. And it is these two combinations that creates the balance of power that effectively forces political elites to become responsive to development. Finally, I do think that any of this, to make this happen, what we're going to need is a Pan-African identity. And I think we take this for granted. But this is going to in part work by citizen and worker mobility. We spoke about a common market yesterday. But a common market can't happen without worker mobility and citizen mobility on the African continent. The South African government, for instance, talks about a common market, but then establishes a visa regime that fundamentally undermines that common market. And it seems to me that we have to think about that. And this is why I do not completely buy into Carlos's critique of cosmopolitanism. I think he too easily hands this terminology to the Western canon of political thought. I think that if you look, Pan-Africanism at its heart is a form of cosmopolitanism with African roots, with an African flavor. It's about a transcendent identity that thinks about bringing together people beyond national and ethnic and other categories. And it's an important identity to create, particularly in a world where we've had the kinds of xenophobic attacks in recent months in South Africa, but we've had these kind of xenophobic attacks, as Carlos said, for some time on the African continent. It's also important to overcome the kinds of visa regimes that exist not only in South Africa, in many parts of the continent. It's more easier to travel on the African continent if you're a German or French or British than it is if you from a citizen of one of these African countries, and we need to change that. So what I am recommending then is not simply an imagination of our future, but also a reflection on the methodology of change, on how we get to the future we want from a very hostile present that we currently exist in. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you. Bayo.
Well, thank you very much, Chair. I'd like to continue from where Adam and before him, Aliun Sal, pitched some of the issues. There's probably no better exponent we have of the case for serious future studies than Aliun Sal, who has worked consistently on this theme over at least 3 or so decades in different theaters. And as he spoke this morning, Chair, it was impossible not to reflect on your email in reaction to this panel when you complained about the difficulty with stargazing into the future. And you've not been alone in expressing this skepticism. And I raise it partly because I myself have always struggled with the domain of futures studies. Not helped in part also by the way in which we experience a lot of what passes for projections into the future from the corner of Africa where I come, where every December or January, an array of prophets treat us to predictions for the year, for the new year. And I know also that not a few people on this continent, especially from Southern Africa, have been seduced by the likes of T.B. Joshua, who apparently have prophetic powers to tell which president will die next and exactly on what day or date to expect the passing of some long-standing tyrant whom citizens want to see exit the political stage. Soyinka had expressed skepticism about this in a famous poem which he titled Requiem for a Futurologist. So as you spoke of stargazing and his references to stargazing in his poem, it was impossible not to go back to that poetry and also begin to reflect on what might be a useful entry point for me on this panel. And I guess also for many of us who are broadly on the left, on the progressive left, we've always considered, I guess, that the tasks at hand are many, are urgent, and require immediate attention. For us to spend too much time in the luxury of projecting into a long-term future. I guess that is partly what Alioune Sall, perhaps he may have been referring more to policy officials, but relevant also to our context when he talked about the tyranny of urgency. There are many tyrannies of urgencies that confront us either as social activists or scholars with some engagement and commitment to transformation, and policy officials who have absolutely no time for research, no time for theory, no time for concepts. They just want solutions immediately. And that in itself has fed some of the skepticism that we, I think, have experienced. It seems to me also that the way in which the field itself has developed over time, with some exceptions, and I guess in some respects, Alioune is one of the more intelligible proponents of the case for future studies on the African continent. But many more are a bit too complicated to read and understand, and they've turned the field into a site of the exoteric, sometimes even blatant daydreaming, as to make futures analysis a bit off-putting. But it seems to me that there are important reasons why we must engage this issue, and in some respects, it's also not terribly new to us in CODESRIA. Kofi Anyido was reminding us of the African Humanities Institute program and a sub-program which it had developed on how we might begin to exercise greater agency in imagining our future. And I recall that a few years ago, we did also organize something in Abuja in the guise of a policy dialogue on how we can better and more effectively capture our future and determine our destiny as a people and as a continent. So philosophically and conceptually, the present not only bears the marks of yesterday, of history, but also embodies the possibilities for the future and how it might be molded. Geopolitically and strategically, there are futures which are being invented for Africa almost on a daily basis by different competing interests in the international system. And I think it's important for us to also begin to contest the invention of those futures. It is not for nothing that the European Union has a 50-year plan for Africa, basically trying to secure the European interest in the full understanding that in a changing world in which Africa would effectively become the battleground for securing the prosperity and welfare of others, it would be important for Europe to exploit both history and geography in order to ensure that it can remain a formidable force in the face of China, and perhaps to some extent the United States. Same thing is true for China. It has a plan for the continent of Africa. The United States has not hidden its own interest in developing a plan. And I guess all of these are manifested in the fact that today Africa has bilateral relationships, what we call the Africa-China partnership, Africa-Europe partnership, Africa, everybody who is anybody in the international system, and which somehow believe that they have a stake in the making of the future world, have effectively courted the African continent and sought to make partnerships with us over a long-term period. I guess Dubai even convened us recently to a forum that took place in Dubai City, basically looking at investments on the African continent. So effectively, these frameworks which begin to define a role for Africa in the international division of labor, which begin to propose a vision for the continent in the world of tomorrow, which we need to encounter, and I suggest also confront in a very direct way. Because to a great extent, much of what has been proposed as vision over the long term is not necessarily vision driven by Africa's own internal interests and concerns, but by calculations of external interests and how these can be secured through the African continent or in relation to engagements with Africa. But I also suggest that the power of many of these futures that are being defined for the continent is actually sometimes felt today in many of our countries. And I just want to give a very good and quick example, which is the case of Nigeria. The CIA, I think 3 or 4 years ago, had in one of its projections suggested that in 2015 Nigeria was likely to collapse. And there are Nigerians in this room. I think there are many people who actually effectively began to live the fact, to live in their daily calculations, the fact that Nigeria was likely to collapse by 2015. And the competition around the 2015 transition and elections was in a certain sense also sharpened by people's generalized, it became a big media issue in Nigerian newspapers. Will Nigeria collapse? Will the country survive or not? So again, I think this is an important reason why the politics, the geopolitics of futures analysis would need to be taken on board. Beyond specific country cases, we have also a variety of institutional settings which define their own long-term relevance and survival in relation to what they consider to be the futures of the African continent. And here, generally, I would say that the entire United Nations system has repositioned itself basically as an important interlocutor for the future of the African continent. Well, time presses. I think our written history also has been one that has been extremely one-sided. We in this community have invested a lot of intellectual firepower responding to suggestions about our present and our future, broadly defined as Afro-pessimistic, in order to create a different narrative about our continent. And I guess some of the enthusiasm which the idea of Africa rising seems to have generated in some quarters is partly because for a long time we have been looking for a different narrative about Africa, even as we are skeptical about the idea of a rising Africa. Rising for who, rising when, rising in what form, and all of the questions which we have raised around these issues. The denial of our agency, which has been a long-standing part of the contemporary history of our continent. The millions of young people, given the demographic composition of our continent, can only make a much greater attention to the future an important part of our preoccupation as a continent. But in engaging the future, as I wind up, I think it's also important for us, and I regret that Alioune only began to deal with this really at the very end of his presentation. It's important for us to understand that, and perhaps here, Adam, I will also raise questions in relation to your analysis on why we should take futures very seriously. that the idea of the collective is itself suffused with relations of power and with the politics that we need to unpack in a context in which today Africa has never been as more unequal and as more fragmented than it is at the present time. The dimensions of inequality, the various dimensions of exclusion which we see on the continent in the context of severely weakened states which are themselves unable effectively to define a systematic policy framework, I think poses important questions of how we might in fact begin to engage in futures analysis, not so much on the basis of a voluntaristic we ought to, but on the basis of an understanding of the kinds of challenges to which we need to respond, particularly in relation to how we might unleash the social movements that would be the bearers of a struggle and competition for alternative visions for the continent. And let us make no mistake about it. The future is already being shaped in our very eyes. Not less than 18 African countries have announced what they call a plan d'émergence. Every country is emerging on the continent, and emergence is on the basis of certain values and certain ideas of what tomorrow ought to be for those countries. At least 34 African countries, before the popularity of the idea of emergence, have themselves also adopted new national visions and long-term plans which define clear perspectives on where they want to go. And these are not often sufficiently contested when they are buried under the idea of a collective we, as though we were all unified behind a common idea of what tomorrow ought to be. And it is the social movements of society, the social movements, the trade unions, and other key players that are in a position in struggle, in politics, to be able to define an alternative future. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So we have a question before us, if you take the last two speeches. And as I read the question, it is basically that the collective must not be an escape from running away from challenges of the present. Put more specifically, Pan-Africanism should not turn into an alibi, so that it's a shelter under which we can just close our eyes to all the problems that exist, hoping that this is some kind of future which will rescue us. But we have to think it through in terms of existing power relations, right? This is how I understand. And Adam will have an opportunity to come back towards the end. Young one.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As Chinese social scientist, I feel honored to be invited to this very important gathering of African community of social sciences. And I would like also to take this opportunity to express my thanks to CODESRIA for the great hospitality with which we are warmly received here. Around the subject of this panel, Inventing a African Future, I would like to make 2 points. First, about the future of Africa. I think in the Chinese research community about African studies, we're all very optimistic about the future of Africa. This is not only because we have observed more than 20 years very good growth record by African continent, but it's also because we could now observe some very positive progress at the theoretical level and the level of planification. For instance, Africa countries in recent years have formulated some very good concept of development, such as NAPAD, developing developmental state, transformation vision, so far and so on. So we find this concept are very, good ones, and many of them are developing into new theories. And they are a bit different from the previous African solutions or African approaches, in that all of this new concepts are trying to combine the role of the market and the role of the states. And they're trying to combine the efforts in addressing external challenges and the domestic reforms. So all this are very positive in our eyes for African development. And secondly, we have also observed some, the formulation of some very promising, project, like the Agenda 2063 as an overall agenda for African development, and many other specific programs in different fields or industries like mining, agriculture, and infrastructure, etc. So with this kind of formulation of new concept theories and project of development, we think that this represents a kind of maturing of African thinking about development, and it is very important for African to own its own future and its own development. This is the first point. And the second point is about whether China-African cooperation may contribute to the efforts in inventing an African future. The answer for me is yes. And I think at least China-African cooperation can benefit African development in four aspects. Number one, this cooperation may help African countries to improve the term of trade. Trade is important, not only in terms of the values, which may contribute to GDP growth, but with China's involvement in international market, buying a lot of natural resources and selling manufactured goods at lower price, that may also contribute to the improvement of the term of trade in favor of African countries. And secondly, China-African cooperation can also contribute to the infrastructure construction of African countries. And thirdly, China could also transfer a lot of adequate technology to African countries by investing in Africa, so as to help African countries to accelerate industrialization and resolve the job creation problem. Because many of these labor-intensive industries in China are losing comparative advantages because of the increase of living cost, labor cost in China, and the need to be transferred to somewhere, where the comparative advantage exists, and Africa is one of the best options. And fourthly, I think China probably may also provide some elements of experiences for development, for the reference of African countries. Over the past 3 decades, China has achieved, for about 30 years, double digital growth, and during that process, accumulated certain, experiences. I won't say Chinese model can be copied by any African countries, but there might be some elements that will be useful for African development. And it deserves a kind of joint research and try to find out, this kind of elements in favor of African development. But finally, I would say that, yes, China could contribute, but probably African side has also to do, its part in promoting this kind of cooperation. And I think three things are extremely important, probably. Number one, we hope that African countries may transform the continental visions or continental project into national, projects and national visions. And secondly, we hope that the investment environment in Africa could be further improved because the supply of labor-intensive technologies are kind of competitive. There are also other regions that need this kind of technologies. For example, South Asian countries. So this is also important. And lastly, I strongly propose a kind of cooperation between Chinese academic community and African academic community, Chinese think tanks and African think tanks, for joint research. I think that will be also very, very important in further promoting China-African relations. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think we have a question here, again, for which you may think about as we move towards discussion, and I'm sure Bio is thinking of this already. The Chinese model, or the Chinese experience, is of interest to Africans for different reasons. I can think of at least two. For the African elite, the Chinese model, or the Chinese experience, is a model for a developmental dictatorship. How to keep the people quiet, right, as development takes place. For majority of Africans, the attraction of the Chinese experience is not simply limited to the period of reform, the neoliberal reform, but to the period of the Chinese Revolution connected to the reform. The attraction is of a relatively equal redistribution of resources, right? Addressing the question of social inequality. There's a tension between these two ways of looking at the same experience. And it comes forth, I would suggest, and when we come to the discussion responses from the floor again, Bio's critique of NEPAD. Okay, so let's think about this too. Benjamin Soares.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this discussion here. I'm actually here from the African Studies Center in the Netherlands, and originally the director of our institute was invited to speak here on this panel, and so I'm here to take his place. So the African Studies Center is quite an old African Studies Center. It was founded in 1947, and I could say by objective criteria, it's been a rather dynamic research institution, and over the years, we've worked with CODESRIA on a number of different projects, which I think have been very beneficial for both partners. I'm actually a social scientist, and but I'm more specifically a scholar of Islam and Muslim societies. When I read the questions that appeared in the program that we were supposed to address, I have to say I found them rather daunting, and the kinds of things that I'm going to say in the few minutes I have will be much more prosaic. So for years, different people have talked about Africa in ways that are characterized as Afro-pessimism. While I'm not pessimistic by nature, I want to talk about what I would call perhaps in a caricature Euro-pessimism. So not Afro-pessimism, but Euro-pessimism. So I would like to ask for your indulgence in advance for the generalizations and gross simplifications I make about this Euro pessimism. But I think that there are a number of developments in Europe that relate to research that will have a dramatic impact on the future of African studies in Europe, area studies, and academic life and pursuits more generally. For several years, and especially since the 2008 financial crisis, academic institutions in many places in Europe have been under increasing pressure. So we all hear about the budget cuts, and also how academics are being forced to raise revenue. So the state no longer wants to provide as many resources as they used to. So hence the rising tuition fees in places like the UK, but also the Netherlands, have made higher education increasingly out of reach, not least for young African scholars who in the past may have wanted to go to Europe to study. And this is, of course, without mentioning Fortress Europe and the difficulty, the increased difficulties for getting visas. In the Netherlands, a relatively small but rather rich country used to provide many scholarships for MA and PhD students at universities throughout the country, and many to African students, Asian students, and other places in the world. But these scholarships are increasingly few and far between, and such scholarships are now usually tied to already existing research programs with predefined themes. So there's the major problem that this does not allow young scholars, Dutch, African, wherever they're from, to develop their own independent intellectual projects. And there is also the increasing pressure for students to finish their studies more quickly. In some places, many students do take many years to finish writing a thesis, but I think that this is also having a deleterious effect on the quality of the work produced. Faced with budget cuts, academics in Europe are under increasing pressure to raise outside funding, and many academics are no longer able to conduct research because of the lack of funding. Those who are successful at raising funds often end up becoming research managers. And this is also because research institutions face budgetary pressures and they're being forced to compete against each other and fighting to advance in league tables or international rankings. And this has led to such distorting phenomenon in some places in Europe of what are called centers of excellence that receive huge cash infusions that allow them to conduct research, finance PhD student scholarships, and so forth. If there are such centers of excellence in Europe, the suggestion is that all the other places are mediocre. The problem is that this has created huge inequities, and the other problem is that such funding is usually only temporary. So yeah, I could go into detail about many valuable Dutch-funded projects such as CEFIS, which had an office here through CODESRIA, which was only funded for a certain period of time, and then it was defunded. It was about South-South history. So one of the problems with these centers of excellence that get all of this money, excellent today, with huge resources and a lot of buzz and a lot of students. And I know quite a few African students who've benefited from learning in such institutions. But in a few years, they become just middling institutions or live on their past glory. This, of course, contrasts with the US system of higher education with its rich private and public universities that can attract global talent as students, giving students scholarships, and of course, attracting global talent for their staff, including some from CODESRIA in the room today. When the ASC worked with CODESRIA and a rich public university on a conference here in Dakar in 2012, much to my surprise, I learned that the rich American university was unable or unwilling to fund the participation of anyone not affiliated with their university. So no young scholars could benefit from this American money. And such an experience was, for me, one small, perfect illustration why CODESRIA needs to exist and it needs to be supported. So let me just maybe sum up a few other things about my Euro-pessimism. There are very worrying developments in Europe which reflect much about the prevailing political mood with the frightening mainstreaming of nativist sentiment in many places and outright anti-academic and anti-intellectual discourse in some countries and in the Netherlands in particular, where we've seen, major research institutions defunded, museums closed, and so forth. And I won't go into any details. Not a pessimist by nature, I would like to say a few things more optimistic about the future. But Chair, I didn't look at the time. How much time do I have left? 2 minutes. Okay. So just very quickly, in recent years, I've noticed how African studies are beginning to flourish in places in the world where the African studies were not flourishing in the past. And this relates to, of course, the increasing multipolar character of the world, and in the Netherlands and Leiden, where we've been developing a research program over the past few years about this changing multipolar world, in the importance of the BRICS countries, but also the MINT countries, Malaysia, Indonesia, Nigeria, and Turkey. My observations are rather anecdotal and might seem banal to some of you. But in the past, say, 9 years, I have taken quite a number of trips to places in Asia and in Turkey. And in Leiden, we've been receiving people in places such as Turkey or in China who want to learn from our long experience of African studies, and we've started to initiate a number of exchanges with people in different places. But let me just mention my experience in Kuala Lumpur, where I attended a conference in African studies at one of the universities in Kuala Lumpur, where I met literally hundreds of Africans who were in Malaysia to study. The world is changing in often astonishing ways. Many people, young people from Francophone Africa, who told me explicitly that they had gone to Malaysia so they could also master English. There's a huge exchange program between Gambia and universities in Malaysia. So the world is changing in new and unexpected ways, I think, that will have an incredible impact on Africa's future, not to mention the 50 Sudanese staff that were at one of the universities I visited in Malaysia. I've also made recent trips to Doha, where there's a very vibrant community of young African scholars developing African studies in ways that I think that CODESRIA should try to engage with more, and the same would apply for African studies in China. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so the floor is open for discussion. Before I recognize, I hope to see some of our established scholars joining in the discussion and responding to this. So I'm looking at Samir Amin here, and I don't know where Tandika is. Are you here, Tandika? Tandika is not here. There is Tandika. Okay, great. So we're going to begin with Samir Amin here, and then I'm coming to Professor here. Yeah, Samir, please, micro.
Oh, thank you, Mahmood. I'll be very, very short because I was so happy with what I heard this morning, first by Alioune Sall and then from this table, that in fact, either I have nothing to add or I would need 3 or 4 hours to add. So I will choose 1.5 minutes. That is on one single point. China. Now, what distinguishes China from, I would say, almost any other country in the world today is that China has a national sovereign project. China had always had this national sovereign project from 1950. It has moved through stages. It is different from one stage to another. It can be qualified differently, not only the oversimplified qualification, socialist or capitalist, but the exact social content of it at each stage, the real one, the relationship between this sovereign project and its conflict with global dominant forces, etc., etc. But it has a sovereign project, which means a sovereign project of, taking the language of Chu Enlai, the 4 modernizations. Modernization, the word I don't like, but that's not important. Building a systematic, integrated, as far as possible, autonomous, industrial, modern system, turned basically for the internal market, but being successful in that respect, able also to be aggressively present on the global market with success. The two being complementary and not in conflict. Second, and that is what is very, very special to 2 countries in the world, and not 3, China and Vietnam. Articulating, associating this industrialized, modernizing, autonomous system with revival and renewal of peasant family agriculture with access to land ensured more or less correctly, more or less equally to everybody. Now this, it is because it has a successful sovereign project that it is successfully attractive to foreign capital, which is in that case, in the case of China, bound to accept conditions. Well, they can manage and to some extent change the conditions by some corruption, as usual everywhere. But bound to, they cannot do anything that they want. They have to. And this is why China is attractive. On the opposite, the countries which have no sovereign project, and I'm saying that at the present stage, no country in Africa has a sovereign project, not even South Africa. And those who had a sovereign project of whatever kind it was in the past, Egypt, Naserian Egypt, and quite a number of others in Africa, do not exist anymore as such. Those who have no sovereign project and who are opening without control because they have no sovereign project to foreign capital doesn't come, or if it comes to plunder and nothing more. plunder quickly and nothing more. That is the major difference, in my view, between the true and exclusive emerging country. There is one emerging country, society, China, for that reason, and the half-half of some others.
Thank you.
And
Thank you,
no, unfortunately, Africa.
I'm afraid you're moving to 2-hour limit. and I don't want to take that option. Not now. So look, I was liberal because Samir is an elder and I have to muster a lot of courage to stop him from speaking, okay? But I assure you I have enough courage to stop the rest here. Please.
C'est Nkolofo, oui. Alors, nous parlons de l'invention de notre futur. Alors, je me pose la question de savoir comment cette invention est possible dans un contexte où l'agenda néolibéral qui a été imposé à l'Afrique se poursuit imperturbablement et s'approfondit même. Sur le plan éducatif, par exemple, je constate que la plupart des pays africains, sinon tous les pays africains, ont adopté le système LMD. Ils ont adopté la fameuse approche par compétence. Et nous savons que cette approche par compétence est contre un projet national d'éducation autonome. Et sur le plan scientifique, je note le triomphe des épistémologies et des méthodologies de la déconstruction, avec tout ce que vous savez, n'est-ce pas, s'agissant de ces épistémologies. Le triomphe, n'est-ce pas, du langage, le triomphe, n'est-ce pas, du constructivisme, le refus de l'histoire, etc., etc. Alors, sur le plan philosophique et religieux, j'observe une offensive idéologique anti-lumière, une offensive contre la raison. Il y a des partis anti-lumière et anti-raison qui se sont constitués un peu partout en Afrique, sous la bannière du postmodernisme et de certaines tendances, d'ailleurs, du postcolonialisme. J'observe dans la même perspective l'émergence des mouvements fondamentalistes, religieux, chrétiens et musulmans du type Boko Haram. Alors, je me demande comment on peut réussir un projet d'invention du futur avec ces obstacles-là. Enfin, je note qu'il y a, par rapport à la Chine, je note une offensive idéologique contre la Chine ici en Afrique, que certains milieux accusent d'impérialisme et de néocolonialisme, justement pour permettre la déconnexion de l'Afrique, de la Chine, et pas seulement de la Chine, mais des autres grands pays du Sud, le Brésil et tout le reste. Merci.
Thank you. Okay, there, and then after this, Tandika, I'm coming to you. Yeah. Oh, okay. But I've already recognized him, and then I will recognize you, and then Tandika, and then I'll come back.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Felwine Sarr, Université Gaston Berger. Donc rapidement, 2 points. La grande difficulté que j'ai, c'est que lorsque j'entends tous les discours qui ont été tenus, j'ai le sentiment que toujours nous sommes dans une répétition des cosmologies, des téléologies et des épistémés des autres. Je me pose la question de savoir à quand une réflexion totalement, je dirais, autonome, à quand une réflexion qui ferait que nous soyons notre lumière propre pour devenir notre puissance propre, et à quand une réflexion qui a l'ambition de dépasser l'économicisme ambiant. Je conçois bien que la question économique doit être traitée et que toutes les propositions qui ont été faites là sont intéressantes, mais à quand une réflexion sur un projet de civilisation, sur un projet qui ferait de l'être, sur une civilisation de l'être et non de l'avoir, et sur une proposition alternative africaine qui aurait tendance à dire: je propose de rééquilibrer les différentes dimensions de l'existence humaine, aussi bien individuelle que collective. J'ai une vieille histoire, j'ai un regard très profond sur l'histoire humaine, et à partir de là, j'ai l'ambition de porter l'humanité à un autre niveau en projetant une société autre que celle qui m'est donnée dans toutes les réflexions que nous entendons là. Alors, comment faire pour avoir une réelle réflexion autonome sur notre avenir et sur un devenir inventé, autre qu'en reprenant des terminologies, des concepts, des visions éculées sur une humanité sur une société qui est en quête de sens et qui s'interroge elle-même. Donc c'est juste ça que j'avais comme interrogation. Et je relève pour terminer. Monsieur Yang nous dit, entre autres choses très intéressantes, que la Chine a perdu son avantage comparatif dans le travail à faible coût, et ce serait bien que l'Afrique prenne le relais de cet avantage comparatif-là. Est-ce une vision pour la Chine ou est-ce une vision pour l'Afrique? Et je suis entièrement d'accord avec Adebayo, toutes ces réflexions et tous ces agendas qui nous viennent du dehors et que nous reprenons peu ou prou ne font pas le lit encore d'une réflexion endogène et autonome. Bien sûr, il y aura des difficultés à traduire en pratique, mais je pense qu'une des premières tâches qui est la nôtre, c'est de nous penser fondamentalement en inventant nos cosmologies et en inventant les métaphores de nos futurs. Je vous remercie.
Okay, thank you very much. There are two requests. One is that when you speak, please introduce yourself, and the second is the camera wants to capture you, so stand up when you speak, please. There was a lady over there, yes, please. Yeah. No, wait, many people before you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Reinventing our future. I am really trying to ask a question. We are here, researchers are talking. And my name is Yasin Fall, I'm an economist, and I have been a member of CODESRIA for many years. Just retired 2 months ago from the UN. So very free to talk, if you are not able to talk. I am really puzzled because we are talking among researchers, and I'm seeing really, I'm very impatient. And I'm seeing a disconnect between research, African researchers, and African people. What we are talking about and discussing, we have our elders, our thinkers, but when I see our governments develop plan written by McKinsey, I think that this, what are the universities or the institutes in Africa that are involved in developing plans, development plans in Africa? It makes me think of the question, when can we discuss in CODESRIA, how do you bring social science research with social organizing? Many of us here, and people older than me, and I'm 62, so I can talk. Many of us here stand up, they even barely talk to a young African. They come to these meetings, they talk among themselves, and they leave. This is the problem. We need to also have a self-criticism about what we do. We have an army of young Africans that are discouraged workers. They're not even looking for a job. They're not even counted when we talk about inclusive growth and employment. So I think that we need to really be much more demanding on ourselves. When do we create the space for organizing and resistance? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, just behind you, please.
Merci. Je m'appelle Marema Touré. Je suis aussi une membre du CODESRIA depuis assez longtemps. Je pense que je peux aller directement sur ce que Yacine vient de dire. C'est Bayo qui disait tout à l'heure qu'il faut qu'on regarde comment nous nous engageons dans l'invention de notre futur. Et je pense que si nous voulons engager notre futur, il nous faut reconnaître quelles sont nos spécificités en Afrique. Et je pense qu'une des spécificités, c'est qu'en Afrique se trouve la rupture la plus profonde entre la tête pensante et le corps social. Quelqu'un a dit qu'il faut avoir des informations sur les acteurs et les facteurs, mais je pense que la problématique qui se pose à nous et qui est répétée toujours en d'autres termes, c'est comment est-ce que nous mobilisons le corps social, c'est-à-dire les jeunes, c'est-à-dire les femmes, c'est-à-dire les vieillards, c'est-à-dire la pensée africaine, c'est-à-dire comment penser l'Afrique à partir de notre propre lieu, comme dirait Cabral, en mobilisant les forces et les cultures et les pensées africaines pour irriguer le projet collectif de l'Afrique. Et je crois que de ce point de vue, notre spécificité en Afrique, c'est que c'est là où l'élaboration du projet collectif se décline dans des langues que ne comprennent pas les Africains. au Nigeria, ici, ailleurs, nous déclinons nos futurs, nos inventions, nous voulons les inventer à partir de langues qui sont empruntées, et je pense que ça, c'est une problématique qu'il faut revisiter. Rapidement, je pense que l'autre seconde rupture, c'est qu'en Afrique, plusieurs années d'ajustement structurel nous ont amenés à ajuster nos propres horizons. Et ajuster nos propres horizons, c'est que c'est Alunsal qui disait ce matin qu'il n'y a que 4 pays africains qui n'ont pas de projet prospectif. Bayo a dit qu'il y a 18 Africains qui sont engagés, pays africains qui sont engagés dans les émergents. Mais je pense que c'est aussi en Afrique où on a adopté l'agenda 2063. Et à mon avis, je crois que la grande limite de l'agenda 2063 qui n'a pas énoncé par Alunsal, c'est que l'agenda 2063 réduit la science à la STI. La STI est très importante, science, technologie, innovation. Mais pour pouvoir réaliser ses propres innovations, il faut d'abord avoir pensé son imaginaire. Je crois que nous devons, en tant que communauté de social-scientistes, regarder aussi comment nous pouvons engager le dialogue avec les décideurs pour que la STI puisse être irriguée par les sciences sociales. Je crois qu'il nous faut 2 choses en résumé, engager avec nos propres peuples et engager avec nos propres décideurs, parce que sinon, nous serons seuls dans notre communauté de chercheurs. Merci, Mahmoud.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Tandika, micro. And then I'm moving to this side of the room for the next 3. So be patient, okay? Yeah, I will recognize you.
I can't hold 2 things and talk. Yeah, look, I didn't really mean to say something. And this is my name is Tandika Mkandawere. I didn't want to say anything, but then the tyranny of age makes me say something. I think there are 2 ways of thinking about. I will be speaking very much from an economist point of view. One feature about the future, we are starting from a very, our initial conditions of Africa is that today Africa is the least developed country in the world, the least developed continent in the world. So we are, in a sense, what might call the last and the latest and the late industrializer. Now, there are 2 theories about how, if you are late, like we are, you can look at the future. One is simply to repeat what others have done. Okay? So the Rosto version, where you just follow the stages of those who were ahead of you. The second one suggests that there are advantages and disadvantages of being late industrializer. Among the disadvantages may be that, well, others are stronger than you are, and therefore they will restrain you, or that they will have preempted certain options. They think they have done, you cannot do them because they know they will block you. And the other version, more optimistic, is that you can learn a lot from others. Learn not to repeat what they have done, but learn to leapfrog, to jump over certain stages that they went through. And that most late industrializers have done that. They have actually not followed the predecessors just passively, but they have actually tried to jump over certain stages. I think this version, which one can attribute to Gerschenkron, makes more sense for late industrializers. But there's a very profound implication, which means that learning becomes extremely important. Learning not passively, but also learning, as I said, to avoid the mistakes of the pioneers, to move faster than they did. And we see with the mobile phone today in Africa, where some African kids have never seen it, they will never see a landline. They've jumped over that certain stage. And that requires research, huge amounts of research, for 2 reasons. One is that the pioneers from whom you want to learn may not want to teach you what they know, or may have forgotten how they got there. Usually they'll idealize their path of progress by saying everything went smoothly, and they want you to follow these norms that they claim are how they went through. So you really have to do your own excavation and your own discovery of how they did it. And so I hope that talking about the future, the role of CODESRIA as a Social Science Research Council was precisely on the research side. What does our discussion here entail for research in Africa? And how do we relate to those who have gone, from whom we can learn, or learn mistakes, or learn how to avoid what they went through? And how do we organize ourselves in terms of within Africa and looking at the future? If we don't do that, we will be engaged in an interesting exercise of speculation about the future, but not extremely helpful as a research community. I think we have to realize that the demands on us will be much, much more rigorous for learning, because we are, as I said, the late industrializer. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As I said, I'm going to recognize two people from here. There was a lady in the middle, yeah, there first, then the gentleman behind second, and this lady here third. And after that, I'm going to request one of our visitors from Taiwan, Quan Shin Chen, to respond to this discussion. We are a very inclusive community, and we make sure that those who come from outside are invited. Please, yeah.
Oh, over there first?
No, behind you.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Maggie, and I'm from the London School of Economics. I was thinking about inventing African futures, and I think nobody's mentioned the question of cartographies and maps, and how do we decipher the future which is already here, and to be able to imagine where we're going and how we can work together as a collective.
Thank you very much. I'm John Mary Kanyamurwa from Chambogo University, Uganda, once again. It's a pleasure really to listen to intellectuals who know their stuff. I'm really very pleased, and I want to thank you so much. However, there are a couple of issues I want to raise. One, that all the speakers have talked about, they have raised the challenges, particularly of academia and supporting research. And what I did not hear are now the strategies on how to strengthen CODESRIA, to actually do research that actually practically feeds into the 2063 development agenda. What are those strategies that we can actually now probably discuss that help into influencing the 2063 agenda? And in any case, to what extent has CODESRIA actually produced practical research that actually has influenced that kind of agenda, 2063 agenda? And fourthly, rather secondary, what are those building strategies that we actually need to link up with the North America, Europe, China, the greatest performers or the greatest actors in a globalized world, because they are the ones who can actually also, in a way, influence our agenda. But we need to have a constructive strategies in which we can actually work with them in order to develop ourselves.
Okay,
thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I have yes, please go ahead. Yeah.
Anta Sain from Howard University. We keep talking about reinventing the future for Africa, and I'm sitting here thinking 20 years from now, 30 years from now, all of us here probably will be replaced by a younger generation. And I don't hear in the narrative, what will we actually do here? My hope is there will be concrete actions that will be taken by CODESRIA. How are we actually going to groom this generation now for them to be leaders of tomorrow. What are we actually going to be doing? How are we going to bridge the gap between the governments and actually us working with them in terms of policies? We keep talking about, for instance, entrepreneurship as the new paradigm, economic paradigm for the younger generation, for them to invest in that. What are we doing actually now for that generation? So we cannot talk about this future without really coming out with concrete action about the youth, because we're all going to be gone and they will be basically here tomorrow. So what are we doing? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ebrima, can we have 20 minutes to close this session? Non-negotiable. Thank you. Because there are so many hands. One indicator of a successful session is that as it moves on, the number of hands going up increase. But one limitation of time is that all of these cannot be recognized. So I can only recognize 3 other people here, and I have Matthew Elm. Where is Matthew? Matthew, please stand up and you can talk, and then we'll have Quan Chin, and then I will recognize 3 from here. Yes, 1, 2, and 3. Yeah. So, oh, where is Wamba? Yes, yes. Hey, look. This is a chair in which you make mistakes. So Wamba should be recognized, definitely. Wamba will be our last speaker. Yeah. Please, Matthew.
Merci, je m'appelle Habib, je suis de l'Université de Tunis. J'ai une petite question à vous poser. Jusqu'à quel point peut-on considérer le débat autour du futur ou bien de l'avenir, peu importe qu'il soit inscrit dans notre ADN ou bien qu'il est construit, ou bien relève de la rationalité ou bien d'une forme d'aliénation culturelle? C'est-à-dire que dans une conjoncture africaine actuelle, marquée beaucoup plus par la pauvreté, par le terrorisme, est-ce qu'il est de notre droit, nous, intellectuels, dans une salle comme ça assez confortable, de parler d'un futur qui nous échappe, en effet, et particulièrement dans une, comme je l'ai dit, dans une conjoncture actuelle marquée beaucoup plus par un terrorisme qui ravage toutes les populations, par une faim, par une vieillesse, par une pauvreté. Donc, analyser, je pense, mes lectures, enfin mes anciennes lectures me reviennent, nous ne sommes pas des sociétés sous-développées, mais plutôt des sociétés sous-analysées. Donc comment construire un avenir tant que notre présent et notre passé n'a pas été réellement et pertinemment analysé? Merci.
Thank you very much. Well, yes, please. Micro. That, by the way, was not Matthew, but he's smart. He got in because he knew I didn't know who was Matthew. So he started speaking. It's wonderful. So,
yeah, thank you. I think we have an opportunity here to return to a proposal that was made to CODESRIA at least 12, 15 years ago by the Humanities Institute program for a special workshop on what was termed Imagining the Future. And we did that proposal because we are aware that prospective thinking, as the keynote speakers indicated, has been a long-standing preoccupation of many of our creative writers, going back to the beginnings of the last century. Kingsley Hayford, 2011, looking 100 years ahead and mapping out a Pan-African agenda with definite strategies for achieving some of these goals. And we come all the way to the more recent times. Amata Edu making a projection where about 20 years from now, Africa will have a 30-year-old woman as the king or the queen or the president, as you choose to call it. So, and you have at least one person writing a novel which was set in 2086, and that novel was written about 40 years ago. And finally, somebody who actually looks forward to what? The year 5000 AD, which most of us will be scared to even imagine. So I would like to revive that proposal. I'll speak with the Executive Secretariat to see if we can revive that proposal so that we can carry this conversation forward as an interface between the social sciences and the humanities.
Thank you. Thank you very much. The lady in the second row, yeah.
There have to be two of them. Thank you very much, Chairperson, for finally recognizing me. I appreciate that. Professor Habib and what's his name? Yang Huang, both of you emphasize the positive role that China is playing in Africa or has a potential to play in African development. I recognize that role, the many positive contributions, but at the same time, I'm very worried as well. Coming from Southern Africa, I have seen how some of Chinese investments in the textile and clothing industry in Zimbabwe, in South Africa, has actually led to deindustrialization. In Zambia, contrary to what Prof. Yang, you said, you emphasize that China can contribute in terms of technology transfer, job creation. There are many instances of countries who have actually said some Chinese companies will come with their own labor, so the investment doesn't create jobs. And the investments in infrastructure, also very positive contribution to development. However, there have been quite a number of complaints when we read the literature that the quality of that infrastructure leaves a lot to be desired. Now, my question is, if China is going to play a positive role, those are the issues to look at. I mean, are you just going to invest into any sector, including those sectors like textile and clothing, which were the mainstay of some of our countries? So I think there needs to be a rethinking. Granted, African countries themselves also need to reflect on what kind of investments they should allow. You also said that in your presentation, and this is addressed to Yang again, you said what you are looking for is better conditions for Chinese investments. I would like to know, what better conditions are you asking for? Prof. Olukoshi, I liked your presentation together with the earlier presentation by Professor Sao this morning. You mentioned that there are many constructions of African futures, and I like that point because there is something that's already on the table. Yes, we still have to vision the future, but there are other constructions of our future which are on the table. And you asked us to interrogate and contest them. You mentioned that some of the development, some countries have actually developed some national development plans. I'm thinking of South Africa as a comprehensive national development plan. Uganda, Botswana, Ethiopia. When you look at them, I actually think that they are visioning their future. So when you ask for contestation, and I'm not disagreeing, I just want clarity, maybe using some of these examples, what is it that you find wrong in those visions that nations have already come up with? Because then it will help us in terms of thinking long term and looking further into the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Quan Chin, back there.
My name is Guang Chen, based in Taiwan. I'm speaking not only for myself. We're part of an intellectual network called Interasia School. And I listening to this for the past 2 days. I guess I want to say the reason why the two of us coming out of that organization to be here is actually to learn from Africa rather than the other way around. And I want to point out, actually, CODESRIA have done, how should I say, has built up something a lot of us, we are very envious, right? We don't have that. You know, in the sense that over the past 40, 50 years, built up a network of not only friendship, but actually in terms of knowledge, its own African subjectivity, if you wish. This is a part of the Pan-African thing which we don't have, right? And so I guess I'm saying in terms, this is a very important thing to focus on the level of intellectual production, intellectual knowledge production, which I'm afraid CODESRIA is, you know, have to shoulder that responsibility, which is to know not only Africa, but also other parts of the world, right, to confront the real situation. So it's not only China in Africa. In order to deal with that question of, you know, of China in Africa, you have to understand China from inside out, right? I think that's a challenge. That's why for a lot of us, very, very innocent about the specificity of Africa. But luckily, I think CODESRIA has built up a work, and so we can learn from. But I think this is something need to be done, you know, with the so-called South-South links, right? Otherwise, we'll be in trouble in this so-called global transformation because we don't know the inside of other places, right? That's, for the moment, I want to say.
Thank you very much. Micro.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, pour la parole. Je m'appelle Wamba Diawamba Ernest. Je voulais parler sur 2 points. Le premier point concerne la question de la connaissance que nous produisons, pourquoi faire. Je vais simplement parler d'un aspect, c'est l'aspect des langues. Quand je suis allé récemment chez moi, j'ai constaté que beaucoup de discussions, des questions de grande importance, questions du futur, questions de constitutionnalisme, etc., ne pénètrent pas dans les masses populaires, en partie parce que les langues de travail ne sont pas celles qu'elles parlent. Parce qu'il y a effectivement dans les masses aussi des conceptions de futur, de l'avenir. J'ai travaillé avec des églises indépendantistes qui pensent que nous sommes encore colonisés du point de vue de la politique, du point de vue du savoir et du point de vue de la spiritualité. C'est une position. Nous pouvons faire des recherches pour savoir que veut dire colonialisme du savoir et qu'est-ce que le CODESRIA a fait pour, en fait, remédier à cette situation. Je disais hier à Habib que je ne voyais pas pourquoi, par exemple, la séance d'ouverture ne pouvait pas être aussi transmise en Wolof, pour permettre à ce que aussi les autres puissent suivre ce qui se passe, ce que nous faisons. Je voulais aussi parler des formes d'organisation, parce que quand nous disons les stratégies, les acteurs qui pourront travailler comme des travailleurs de changement, pour qu'on puisse arriver à ce que le matin on disait être l'État stratège, je pense que nous devons aussi étudier quelles sont les formes sociales qui se développent parmi la population elle-même. Nous savons aujourd'hui que les partis politiques ne constituent pas vraiment des formes qui peuvent former des travailleurs de changement. Je ne peux pas aller en détail. Ce sont les 2 points que je voulais. Question de langue et question de forme d'organisation. Je vous remercie.
Thank you very much. Now, before I return to the panel here, I'm going to squeeze in one more person because I see such unhappiness on his face that I am not willing to take the responsibility of denying him the floor. Please.
Merci Mamdani de me donner la parole. En fait, je ne voulais pas parler, mais après avoir entendu pendant plus de 50 ans les mêmes rengaines et voir ce que l'Afrique devient aujourd'hui, je me sens l'obligation de dire un mot. Je pense qu'il faut d'abord vouloir construire un avenir, un futur, si vous le voulez. Et pour cela, je pense qu'il y a deux conditions. Après toutes les réflexions que j'ai partagées avec mes aînés et que je partage avec les plus jeunes aujourd'hui, je pense que la première condition, l'Afrique doit tourner le dos à la mer et regarder son hinterland. Du quai, nous sommes là à la pointe des Almadies et je pense que la statue de la Renaissance africaine est en train de regarder à l'horizon, vers l'Amérique, alors qu'elle devait regarder vers Addis Abeba, vers, comment on appelle ça, vers Djibouti, vers Mogadiscio ou vers le Cap. Ça, c'est un. Donc, tourner le dos à la mer, que ce soit à Djibouti, que ce soit ailleurs. La deuxième condition, je pense, il faut sortir la conférence de Berlin par la grande porte. Tant que nous n'avons pas accompli ces deux conditions, nous ne pourrons pas construire un avenir pour l'Afrique.
Thank you very much. I'm told that there is another session after this before we go to lunch. So I'm going to request the panelists to cut down from 5 minutes to 2 minutes, but you promise 1 minute, okay? So let's begin with Benjamin Soares.
Yeah, I think perhaps in response to Professor Makandawire's comment about the importance of learning, I really think CODESRIA is well placed to take a leadership role in, well, leadership and training of these younger scholars. But unfortunately, it would appear that we're all facing the same budgetary constraints and this push to raise money, and I think that we're going to have to get even more creative.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for the very rich conversation. I would like to group some of the interventions in terms of my own response to them, and beginning with Samil's strong emphasis on the importance of a national, a coherent national sovereign project, which I see as a subset of a broader project of society of the type for which we wished at a certain point in the post-colonial context. It would seem to me that part of the difficulty in many of the futures that are currently being invented, whether it be with NEPAD, with which we dealt some 20 years ago or so, or with regard to Agenda 2063, or even with the post-2015 Global Development Agenda, is essentially that Africa lacks precisely that kind of a sovereign national project, and therefore imbibes narratives about itself to which it seeks to respond by itself. That is where the autonomy really lies at the end of the day, using our own language, using our own format to explain to the world that we have heard the world and we are prepared to adapt to the world in terms of what the world expects of us. And therefore, Yasin, it is not surprising that whether it be at the level of national visions and plans or with regard to even broader continental agendas, there's a strong element of donorization that drives a lot of the thinking. I've had occasion to caution that even within the context of the African Union, where many continental standards are being developed for domestication at the national level, we haven't been sufficiently alert to the fact that many of them are underwritten by specific donor interests in a context of a continuing incapacitation and weakness. And you know it coming from UN Women and the entire UN system. In the context of continuing incapacitation of the AU, in the absence of a political vision for the continent that is bold and imaginative, we are basically surrendered to the same broad forces, this time operating indirectly through our own structures in order to define plans and agendas for us and to put in place incentives which then proceed to inspire the kinds of action which we see at the national level. And this is the kind of future which I say must be contested. We need to be much more awake to it, and we need to be able to take it on in order precisely to operate from the point of view, Felwyn, you said, of a decolonized frame of reference that enables us autonomously to define a project for our own development context. Tandika's point about the centrality of higher education, I suppose this is part of the pressure of time. It's one of the issues which I consider to be very important, the place of research, the place of higher education. To start with, at a purely technical level, it's impossible to talk of any meaningful future study which is not grounded on the most rigorous research. And the best analysis of a futuristic kind which I read is the type which is itself not only historically anchored, but sufficiently informed about trends that are occurring in the present as to be able to make reasonable projections beyond journalistic speculation into the future. Now, two responses which are inadequate. One of them, since you spoke as an economist, I would particularly want to warn us against, is the increasing submission of other social science disciplines to the dictates of a particular version of economics, which basically consists in making cheap and easy correlations and flying statistics around in the way in which a whole host of scholars have done in recent times, making simple correlations. Do A and you get B, and using statistics. Moving economics into the study, that kind of economics into the study of conflicts, and making projections about what conflict resolution might look like. I'm particularly attracted by the suggestion which was made by one of the guests, I think from Taiwan, Wen Qian, essentially about the importance at this point in time for us not only to invest in research about ourselves, but research about others. We are not studying China. We are not studying Brazil. We kind of still operate in a world of sentimental solidarity, as if the world owes us a living. The world doesn't owe us a living. And whatever anybody would push from different parts of the world about what may be good for Africa, ultimately it has to be first and foremost good for them. We don't know what makes China tick at the end of the day. We lost that opportunity with the West. Perhaps people like Mahmood came on their own, of their own really, at a point when also they broke out of this prison of secondary information about what happens in other parts of the world, and being able to combine the best of ethnographic research, for which CODESRIA is strong historically, on the continent, about Africa, and a better first-hand understanding of what goes on in other parts of the world, of US foreign policy calculations, for example, in good Muslim, bad Muslim, in order to be able to inform our analysis and achieve that kind of autonomy that we seek. So I really look forward. I hope that in terms of our future agenda as a council, that one of the key areas of work we should seek to develop is precisely to nurture and support a cohort of younger African scholars, that next generation, not to repeat what we did. We spent time reacting. African studies made in USA was very good, but it was reactive at a certain level, until we are able to also do research that shows that actually that neo-patrimonialism they were criticizing as an African specificity is written into the very fabric of American politics and other Western politics, then we would not, in fact, be able to break that prism and do what you are saying, Soares, in terms of reinventing African studies. Not to do what it did yesterday in Europe, but to do something completely new that will be liberating and emancipatory for us.
Thank you very much. The lion has eaten into your time.
I see.
So you've got to...
So I'm going to follow up from that, because I think Sabir is right. I mean, the real lesson of development over the last 50 years is the fact that China was part of a national sovereignty project. And it seems to me that there are two questions that flow from it. How did they create it? And the second is, what is the leverage they had to enable them to marshal foreign investors in the way they did? And the trick for Africa is, how do you do that on a continental platform rather than a national platform? And it seems to me that that's the lesson we need to learn from other regional and continental experiences and think through how we do that. And that's what I was trying to actually grapple with. We don't deal with the strategy so much often enough, and perhaps that's what we should be figuring out. How did the Chinese do it? How did the South Koreans do it? What are the lessons for us to learn? And how do you adapt those lessons on a continental platform to overcome all of the national, the kind of chauvinism of national political elites? The second thing, which I think is important, Thandika makes the point, how do we enable learning? And I want to make 3 suggestions, which are probably unpopular, but I do think we want to think about it. 1, you can't have deep learning if you don't diversify your higher education system. All great higher education systems are diversified and then linked together. We've been reluctant to do this on the continent. So we need to have some institutions that are targeted explicitly at the provision of human resources, and others that are structured for the kinds of deep learning, both the social sciences and the economic sciences, but also in the sciences, in the natural sciences. How do you create natural science technologies that are responsive to local conditions? It's absolutely fundamental. How do you have renewable energy that speaks to the local conditions rather than simply being imported from the conditions of elsewhere in the world? And that's the thing that we need to do. Thirdly, you absolutely need it on a continental framework. That's the real deep learning that we need to start thinking through, and how do we structure it. I want to end on this point, because this point was made about China and Chinese investors. Chinese investors are going to be exploitative, like any investors anywhere in the world. I think we're deluding ourselves if we think investors are not in the job of exploitation. Their job is to make profit. That's their job. What we've got to think through is, how do we politically create the mechanisms, the power, the leverage to marshal those investors in directions we want rather than simply in directions they want. That's the real art of development. It's about giving us power and allowing that power to be deployed in ways to make other people's agendas become our own agendas. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm glad to hear a Vice Chancellor speak like this. I hope that he speaks like this back home also. Now, young Guang has 3 minutes to tell us how China did it.
So the chairman gives me 3 minutes is a big challenge. What I'm going to do is to pick up 4 questions concerning China directly. 2 are from the chairperson, and the 2 others are from the floor. The first question is about China's, social disparity. It's a big challenge. In China, the Gini coefficient is high. But if you look at the other coin of the other side of the coin, other part of the story, over the past 30 years, 95% of Chinese have got rid of poverty. In other words, nowadays, more than 95% of people are living above international poverty line. But the proportion used to be the opposite. 95% live below the poverty line 30 years ago. So, but it does not mean that social disparity is not a problem. China now is is trying very hard to resolve this problem. For this, I would like to draw your attention to the latest initiative launched by the Chinese government, which is called One Belt, One Road Initiative. One of the goals of that initiative is to improve living conditions in the west part of China, where most of poor people live nowadays. The second question is about dictatorship or development. I think there's no universal value or universal standard about the form of government, and the one-party ruling is not necessarily linked to dictatorship. All depends on what kind of goods the government deliver to the people. China and African countries are all, if you look at the per capita income, they are all developing countries. So our shared goal is to improve the economic condition of the country. And if this ruling party has helped more than 95% of people get rid of poverty, if it helped the country to achieve a double-digit growth rate over 3 decades, I think this is a good government. If we use the term of Deng Xiaoping, whether it's a black cat or a white cat, it's a good cat if it can catch the mouse. Okay, so the Chinese party is a good cat, catching the mouse. No matter black or white, I mean, it could be a yellow one. And the third question is about neo-colonialism. Yes, there's a debate about that, and I agree with the gentleman that it's also ideological offense from the Western world. But I think when we talk about neo-colonialism, we have to be very clear about the definition. What is neo-colonialism? This term was formulated first by an African, the former Prime Minister of Ghana, Mr. Nkrumah. And he first used this term in his book, Neo-Colonialism, the Highest Stage of Imperialism. Right? It was published in 1961, I think, then translated into Chinese. So according to his definition and many theoretical supports, the neo-colonialism is defined as, after independence, the African countries still suffer from a kind of exploitation by the former colonial powers, because the former colonial powers, by manipulating the prices of raw materials and keep it low and supply manufacturing goods at a higher price, worsen the term of trade at the expense of the African countries. In that way, they transfer fortune from African countries to the developed countries. So this is the very definition of colonialism. But what China is doing is exactly the opposite. If you observe closely, whatever China buy is become expensive. What China buy? Raw materials. Whatever China sell become cheaper. What China is buying? Sell. China sell manufactured goods. So what China is doing is rather anti-neo-colonialism instead of colonialism, right? And the fourth, this is my answer. The very last question, sorry, it's about 3 minutes, is about what should be improved in the investment environment in Africa. This is a question raised by the lady. There are many, actually. I won't say China's investment environment is perfect. For instance, there's a need to improve the security environment. And there is a need to further expand the size of the market by regional and continental integration. Now, if you improve in this regard, you will make Africa more attractive to Chinese investment. Oh, sorry, 10 seconds for another question about China. It's about the whether Chinese presence in Africa deindustrialize Africa. I led a group to do a field work in Africa in 2008 about the corporate social responsibility of Chinese enterprises in China, in Africa. And according my investigation, we have to distinguish two kinds of so-called investment. One is direct investment. Another one is actually a kind of trade of service. The laborers working in the infrastructure field. In the former one, at least 80% of the workers are from the African countries. In other words, the localization of labor is above 80%. But in this later one, things is different because it's kind of service that African countries buy from Chinese companies. So what Chinese company has to deliver is not job creation, but the project on time. So in that case, the labor content percentage of Chinese laborers could be higher. I hope I have answered.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you very much. Look, I'm aware that a number of you have questions and you didn't get the opportunity to ask, and I think the only thing one can do where sessions are limited in time is to suggest that you approach the individual speakers at any time, really, before they go to sleep, and talk, ask your question. Thank you very much. Thank you to the panel and Secretariat. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you, Mahmood. It was good.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. Thank you. It was very good.